process, or you deal with Ibn Saud, or you deal with Sisi, there's a transcendental problem, and that is the assumption of all, that something that I feel as with every time I travel in the Muslim world, except among certain groups, that the true God or devil, and the different sides of the same fallacy, is America. Either America is the God that cannot be disobeyed. For instance, everyone in Saudi Arabia and the Emirati government, it's inconceivable. Are you crazy? Why you want to say something different? All our schools, all our teachers, all our narratives, or even to the point that now most Arab leaders don't bother having their children learn Arabic. They study now universities. They come and study at USC. Of course, if they studied at UCLA, it would have been okay. But they study at USC instead. The whole Saudi royal family. But at the same time that we have this, or the U.S. is the embodiment of evil, and the evil which, if you conquer, you establish goodness in earth. I don't know what is idolatry if this is not idolatry. Whether you see the U.S. as a god or as the devil, it's an idolatry. And you repeatedly see it in various forms of political Islam, left and right. But that's another thing to engage in, another conversation. If I live long enough, I will take on with whatever whatever God might bring.
Thank you. Sami.
Thank you, Doctor. It was a very enlightening lecture. My question is about something you gave in an answer. The Khaled al-Abad, the miracles, taking place on the hands of those who are, you use the word saintly. So I'm going to take the word miracle, saints, and prophets. And I want to take a look at how good of a saint was the Prophet Muhammad. And let me assure you, 4 of my professors here will testify I am anything but Salafi or Wahhabi. So I'm not coming at it from that point of view. But the fact that we can put together miracles for those who are humans with special access to God versus more or less lack of miracles from the Prophet himself. If you can speak about that, I'll be very grateful. Thank you.
As we often we learn in Islamic theology, well, there are two things. One, in Islamic theology, the catechism is the miracle of the Prophet was the greatest miracle of all, and that is the Quran. That was the proof of his prophecy. But even then, you find that Islamic tradition, there are so many hadiths and sunnah reports that, in fact, have the Prophet, somewhat inconsistent with his catechism, performing miracles, such as feeding an army from a single pot, or having a miracle performed, his heart is washed by. There are numerous, and that tradition in which the Prophet performs a miraculous breaches the laws of physicality and causation, and among them the Isra and the Mi'raj, again, breaches the laws of normal laws of causation. It sits in tension with the idea that his only miracle was the Quran. And that's why I honestly tell my students, I stop and I find joy only in reading people who are long dead, because in pre-modern Islam there was a much greater there was no idolatry of America, so people spoke without having in their mind, am I appeasing or opposing the West? They had that freedom that you find among our youth when they just, do whatever and they dare call it fashion and cutting edge without thinking about, people in Egypt or in China, whether they're going to think it's cool or not. But people in Egypt and China will always think, do Americans think it's cool or not? So in these honest narratives in the tradition of Islam, this issue was brought very forthrightly, brought up, and there developed schools of thought, that believed that the Prophet Muhammad did have miracles of kharq al-'ada, but that they all, my God, you can read in the Jawahir al-Miyat al-Shama'il al-Muhammadiyya and so on, a great deal about the difference between the miracles that Muhammad would perform versus the miracles that Musa would perform or Isa would perform, Jesus would perform. And then the other school, which insisted that no, these reports are fabrications and remain purist in that, insisting that his miracle was the Quran and that's it. And they tended to be, and many modern Muslims would be surprised to know that they tended to be among the Mu'tazili or rationalist Mu'tazili or neo-Mu'tazili type school of thought, which felt very uncomfortable with the idea of kharq al-'ada in most cases, the breaking with causation. Now, there's a lot that we can debate about the status of a person that, I'll respond in the way that Rumi is alleged to respond to someone who asked him that question. Rumi said, well, what do you say about Khidr? Khidr is this character in the Quran who goes around performing miracles and or performing acts and teaching Moses. And Moses is learning from Khidr, but Khidr is not a prophet until the modern age among Salafis. They try to renegotiate that. But so Rumi said, who was more knowledgeable, Khidr or Musa? Now, of course, there in all of these, and that is why you often find in the Sufi traditions in particular, if you study the anthropology and sociology of Sufi traditions, from an anthropological and sociological perspective, you find a great deal of emphasis on the specialness of the Prophet, nearly a sanctification of the Prophet into a divine being. And I believe that is partly because of the desire to clearly separate the status, the elevated status of the Prophet from any possible saint that comes after the Prophet, whether that, the various aqtab of the Ummah and so on. It's a lot more can be said about this, a lot more, but what we often, the thing that is most uncomfortable, and here I'm talking about people who are going to be, inshallah, chaplains and so on, is the Islamic tradition is vast and rich and truly like an ocean. And that's why the cover of this book is by the way, this is a Japanese Muslim artist who wrote Surah Luqman, which is the surah full of ethics, in the design of an ocean, because the Quranic verse that with the wisdom of your Lord, if the oceans were the ink for the wisdom of your Lord, the oceans would run out and the wisdom of your Lord would run out and so on. The biggest problem that I have is that in this, as well as so many issues, we can find schools of thoughts, nuances, debatable positions of narratives and counter-narratives, orientations and counter-orientations. We can find trends that were successful, trends that were not successful, trends that died off and that perhaps need to be rethought today and brought back to life. And trends that died off, and we will think, thank God they died off, because they could have caused, but that acceptance, that packaging of the Islamic tradition as if it is like the Native American tradition in cowboy movies. They all look the same, they all die the same, they all scream the same, and they all pretty much, have the same ridiculous customs. It's problematic, especially when it's done by Muslims. And sadly, I say that it's done by Muslims far more than it's done by non-Muslims. It's Muslims themselves who stereotype and degrade their tradition. And that then empowers those who are ill-willed and want to further stereotype and further degrade this tradition. Allah.
Are you accepting some more questions?
One more, and then
One more question, so we'll ask the lady. Yes.
My name is Jasmine. I'm a student of the seminary, and my question is, if we compare this idea of godliness and godlessness to the humanism of the Renaissance, then can we say that this hardening of hearts, becoming like rocks, is synonymous to the animality or the lack of reason in humanism?
that is, there's an excellent question. I'm sorry. I have to take a heart medicine that gets weight, so I'm not being, rude. That is an excellent question, and I would, because I do talk about that in the book. This idea of godliness and godlessness, and the points of contact and points of disconnect that one can negotiate with the humanist tradition, particularly the humanist tradition, both as an ideal and as very much like many of the challenges that religion met. It's an ideal that raised very lofty principles like the end of slavery, but also created very decrepit realities, like the spread of colonialism and the institutionalization of slavery in Africa. And so that it shares with the attempt, the effort to be godly. I mean, the secularists who want to exclude religion from the public sphere and they think religion is just always messes things up and always causes evil. What they often miss is the same struggles that religion has fought with particular ideals. The non-religious ideologies or the irreligious ideologies have done the same and sometimes worse. But ultimately, I admit that I find the natural connect for me is what much better people than I have discovered in the writings of someone like Qadi Abdul Jabbar or in al-Aqid in much more developed form, where the notion of God's mercy as inseparable from God's beauty, and the idea of beauty, and that God created human beings in the most beautiful form, as the ethics of virtue, and I talk about it's aesthetics that become ethics of virtue, normative aesthetical standards. So one of the sort of cool things in philosophical debates today is to trash aesthetics and to say aesthetics is nonsense. And to some extent, it's still cool to attempt to deconstruct virtue and to poo-poo it and say, only stupid people believe in virtue. But I think that's completely flawed. Aesthetics do yield moral normative values, and virtue and aesthetics find natural bonds, very much like godliness, mercy, beauty are roads that interconnect and lead to each other. And anyone who truly encounters, and here I'm sorry, I sound more like the person who wrote The Search for Beauty in Islam, but anyone who has tasted the sweetness of an instant with God's beauty lives craving that beauty in everything. And cannot manage their life it reminds me of teachers both in Christian and Islam. But one of my teachers who in Cairo, every time one of the students would come crying and saying, "Oh, I sinned, I've done a sin," and say, "You haven't loved God enough. Go work on your love toward God." Very different from Puritan Islam, isn't it? I still remember the verse, "You haven't loved God enough. Go work on loving God." Because once you love God, you see your love for that beauty will prevent anything else. So, I'm not trying to steal your students, just as a disclaimer, but
You can have them.
but I look for students who work on this particular point, but they have to have considerable philosophical and theological abilities to develop this. But
Thank you very much. Just a brief word to conclude, and thank Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl. I'm sure that if Professor William Bijlefeld was still with us, he would have enjoyed listening to you as much as we did. And we all have to be thankful, because it is thanks to him and his family that we are able to invite at Hartford Seminary on such brilliant lecturers. And if I have to just memorize something from this lecture, rather than looking for reasons for cruelty, let's look for a cure. And as the Quran says, for each of you we have set a way and a path. And we have heard tonight that Shari'ah, the path, must be a dream, or is a dream, of beautification through godliness. Thank you for teaching us such deep wisdom, and we hope to be able to see you again, and we wish you well. Yes. Before you go, if some of you are interested in purchasing the last book of Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl, he will be ready to sign the copies.